Hello there, just checking you can see me. Yep, that looks like it's working. Hello, how's it going? See if we've got anybody joining us. Hey Kate, how's it going? Yep, there's a dozen of us so far. There's been a change in how Zoom does, or basically I use a camera called Mevo, and now Mevo is compatible with Zoom. So I think I'm going to go back to the way we used to do these, which was via Zoom, because then that allows people to comment live, chat, ask questions in person, see other people who are there. When we did it like that, there was always lots more people who came to the seminars. Now most people just kind of watch them after the fact. So I'm going to try and do that. I would have done it for this one, but they're not linking up. There's something that's gone wrong. I've kind of downloaded the app, I've done everything, but it's a beta, so I think there's some still little kinks to sort out, probably something I'm doing wrong, so I'm going to kind of look into it in the next couple of weeks. So by the next Pyro seminar we should be good to go. So it'll look like this, but as I said, it'll be on Zoom, so you'll be able to kind of interact live. For now, all you can do is type your questions into the chat box. If you're watching this on Patreon, then what you want to do is click at the top of the video. There's a title, click that, that should bring you to YouTube, and then you can kind of chat in the chat box. So, if that all sounds good, oh, there's Julie and Bill, fantastic. We'll get started. I'm guessing you can all hear me clearly enough. All right. Hello there and welcome to another Pyro seminar. I don't know what number this is now. We must be up in the 30s or 40s. As you know, kind of one of the, I don't want to say this was there from the beginning, although maybe it was there from the beginning in some form, but very much something that's become important to me and to my work is basically drawing out the problems with a type of spirituality that sees the world as a type of balance, a type of whole, that offers us the idea that we can somehow find satisfaction in this life or the next. So in a religious way, it's the idea that we can, maybe get to heaven, and in heaven we will find that all of our desire is filled up, that we get what we most desire. We are fulfilled, we are satisfied. Our hearts are restless until finally they find their rest in God. And then, secular forms of this, which is that we can find satisfaction through certain commodities, through a certain lifestyle. And it doesn't have to be a lifestyle of wealth. It can be a lifestyle in which you leave everything behind, get a little house in the countryside and, check out of society. But whatever it is, there's something that can offer you a type of satisfaction. We've talked about religions of hedonism and religions that kind of offer us the thing, or religions of nihilism, which promise that we can escape the dissatisfaction of life by getting rid of our desire. But ultimately, we're caught up in dissatisfaction in so many ways in our lives, and we're caught up in discontent. And very early on in my work, I've been interested in what does it mean to desire in a productive way, and in a way that brings meaning and depth to our lives, and a way that brings positive transformation to the world. And the reason for that kind of question is because from early on I've been influenced by the idea that fundamentally we are our desire. There's something fundamental about being human which is connected to desire. And I'm not going to get into all of that now, but I'm just saying that, especially in the last few years, I've done critiques of kind of oneness theology and looked at various forms of New Age spirituality and drawn out my concerns. And this seminar is just going to continue that. I'm going to look at it in a slightly different way. We're going to look at Simone Weil we're going to look at Paul Tillich, we're going to look a little bit at Lacan. And we're going to look at particularly one issue, which is the issue of God and our relation to God in terms of desire. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Simone Weil asked a very interesting question. She returned to it many times in the book Gravity and Grace. Now, Simone Weil, by the way, she was a very brilliant thinker, but didn't really engage in philosophy directly. She kind of wrote in aphorisms and in fragments, and but I think she came top of her year in the Paris school, and she was part of the intellectual circles of her day. A very, very brilliant thinker. But we don't have very much in terms of, as I say, kind of systematic work. But what she does give us is very pregnant, is very, very strong. And in Gravity and Grace, she comes back to a question a number of times. It actually kind of, it is the question that perhaps is the key to understanding the book. And the question is, and you've heard me say this before in other contexts, but is, what does a miser lose when they lose their treasure, right? And she is probably thinking about Aesop's fable, where a miser has treasure buried in the bottom of the garden and goes every week and counts the treasure. And one week, a robber steals the treasure. He comes back, the treasure's gone, and this miser bursts into tears. And some neighbours ask him what happened. He says that this treasure was stolen. One of the neighbours says, well, what did you do with the treasure anyway? And he said, I didn't do anything with it. I just kept it buried under the tree, and once a week I would count it. And so the neighbour picked up some pebbles and threw them into the hole and said, well, count those, it will do you as much good, right? Now, it's a really interesting question, right? What does the miser lose? Because the miser is incredibly upset. But why? Because in a way, the miser hasn't lost anything. Because the miser didn't use the treasure. The treasure is value that can be used to purchase things. But that's not what he's doing. But also, he keeps the treasure. He has a certain distance to it. So there's something he's lost because he's crying. There's something that's really affected him. He's not putting that on. He's not lying. Like, the tears are real. But what is it that he's crying about? Now, for Simone Weil, this is very clever because it's a theory of desire. For Simone Weil, what the miser loses is a type of lack that generates his desire, that keeps his desire alive. So basically, what the miser has worked out is that the real enjoyment of treasure, of his treasure, is not in spending it, or in just completely giving it away to other people and losing it. It's in somehow having a type of relationship to its distance. It's about having some sort of spatial relation to it. Now, I guess at this point it would be worth kind of just making a distinction between two types of desire, right? We could call it animalistic desire, which is desire that can be satisfied, right? So when animals are looking for food or for shelter, their desire can be satisfied, and when it's satisfied, they're content. And we have those types of desires within us. We might be hungry and we eat. We might want to see friends, we go out. But we also have a type of excessive desire. An excessive desire that is not just kind of for utilitarian value, right? It's not just we look for things that will satisfy some need within us, but we experience this profound desire. And it's that profound desire that really makes us human. I mean, even at a very practical level, when you feel that level of desire in you, you will feel alive. I mean, whenever you say someone falls in love, you feel like people will say, I just feel alive. I was dead before. I was just walking around. This is just kind of lit a fire within me. Or if someone is in love with a cause, again, it's like, once I discovered this cause, I discovered a meaning of life. If you were doing the book study that we were doing on Paul Tillich, he was talking about ultimate concern as something that we will give our life to, something that we will live and die for. But then he clarified it. He said, like, I don't mean literally like kill yourself for or sacrifice yourself for, but more deeply, it's something that makes life worth living. And when you lose it, it makes life a form of death. And so in kind of religious language, you can talk about life and death. So whenever Jesus often talks about life and death, it's not about physical death and physical life, right? He says, I have come to bring life and life in all its fullness. But he's not talking about, obviously, literal life. Or let the dead bury the dead. When he's talking about the first type of death is a living death. So you have this very kind of religious concept, not of life and death in a purely empirical way, but we can talk about life and death as a form of being in the world in which we feel like we are kind of like standing out, that there is something that is giving us a reason for existence. So not just existence, a reason for existence. And that's what we're talking about here, right? The miser has found a way of having an intense enjoyment through not having the treasure. So if he spends the money, if he uses the treasure, he'll get things that will be enjoyable, but he will lose that incredible satisfaction that he's experiencing. And if it's stolen from him, again, it will be taken away. So for Simone Weil, the miser is an example of someone who, in a negative way, shows us the truth of desire. That the most powerful form of desire, human desire, is not really desire for something. It's a type of desire for nothing. It's inflamed by a lack, right? Lack is central to this incredible form of desire. And that actually, we don't want to satisfy that desire. It's actually that lack and that kind of fire of desire that is itself pleasurable. There's something powerful in it. So if you're in love with someone and they are kind of inaccessible in some way, I mean, there's still a passion and an enjoyment of the struggle to try to win them over or to be with them. And it's kind of like almost like that's where the incredible thing is. So for example, marriage or breaking up with someone can both be traumatic events, because like the miser's treasure, right? The object of your desire is a person. Potentially if you marry them, it's like closing the distance between them, and maybe then you'll fall into kind of boredom. Or if you break up with them, it's like someone stealing the treasure. That person goes off with someone else, and we all have seen this in our own lives or other people's lives, where the person's fine until they see their partner or their ex-partner with somebody else, and then they just fall apart. They break down because that has brought home to them that what they had that was generating all of this desire is now utterly gone and inaccessible. So, the marriage analogy kind of fits to some extent with the miser, right? That's always kind of a bit of a dilemma for people, the extinguishing of love through either extreme, or no, the extinguishing of desire through either extreme. And we'll come back to love at the end of the seminar, because there's a way that's less tragic than that. That sounds terrible. It's like the bridges of Madison County, when the woman can either be with her husband and be depressed, but he's a nice guy, or run away with the photographer, who's this incredibly interesting person, but it's going to be a disaster, right? But it's kind of, you're caught in this tragic between a rock and a hard place. So Simone Weil goes, right, there is something about desire that involves not having, and actually the miser has developed a strategy for keeping that alive. So the miser is enjoying their lack. They are going down, they're counting their treasure. There's something enjoyable about not spending this. It's also having a negative impact on their life potentially, but we'll skip that, right? Counting the treasure, having this pleasure. You could call this a type of quantum indeterminacy, right? Where the miser is able to maintain a space between presence and absence. So we have particle duality. This is like presence, absence duality. The miser has the treasure but doesn't have the treasure. And in that space, desire is born. So it's a type of Schrödinger's cat, Schrödinger's treasure, right? And the problem, of course, for the miser is this, just like Schrödinger's cat, right? The cat is put in a box, and there is a poison capsule, and if this subatomic particle degenerates, the poison is released, and if it doesn't, the poison isn't released. And the whole idea, if you don't know the thought experiment, is that because of quantum undecidability, when you don't observe this quantum particle, it's in every state. So it's both decomposed and not decomposed, which means the gas is both being released and not being released, which means the cat is both alive and dead, right? That's as long as you don't observe, but as soon as you open the box to observe the cat, it'll be either alive or dead, right? So your observation crunches this indeterminacy into a binary opposition, right? That's in basic. So in a way, that's what this treasure is, right? The miser is keeping this type of presence-absence duality, but it can be crunched into a position. Either the miser gets too close and uses the treasure, or it's stolen away. And so this is where Simone Weil comes in. Simone Weil says that the miser gives us a glimpse into what we mean by the word God. So Simone Weil isn't arguing for the existence of God. In fact, this could be an argument for the non-existence of God, right? She says that basically that religious practice and religious symbols point to a type of treasure that can never be appropriated, taken, or stolen. A treasure that you cannot grasp and also you cannot escape from. And you've got all of these religious ideas of no matter how far you run, God will always be there. You will never be separated from God. And at the other side, all of this stuff about how you can never grasp God, see the face of God, that there is always this absolute chasm between you and the absolute. So you do have this kind of quantum dimension within religious language. And Weil is basically saying that God is the name for this nothingness that generates human desire, that makes us desirable creatures. And so in a strange way, and this is the trick for Simone Weil, right? She could say, nothing satisfies us, right? So the common sense way of hearing that phrase is nothing satisfies us. No thing will ever give you satisfaction. When you grasp the treasure, it will not live up to that excessive experience, the fantasy that you have for it. Nothing will. But then Simone Weil adds the second meaning, which is nothing can satisfy us, which is we can't directly realize that the lack is what generates desire. And if we directly embrace the lack itself, we will find a form of satisfaction. In fact, for Simone Weil, this will make us not misers, right? Because we won't care about earthly treasures. We won't care. We'll be freed from this notion that some material thing in the world will bring us absolute satisfaction, which is the promise of sacred and secular religions. It's what hooks us. It's often what hooks us into jobs we don't like. It hooks us into trying to get things that we think will fix us. It gets us, getting into self-help and all this kind of stuff, right? We are every day kind of caught up in the idea that something will satisfy us. And the terror is the idea that nothing will satisfy us. But then Simone Weil goes to a third position, right? So there's like the fear that nothing will satisfy you. And then there's the hope that something will satisfy you. And then there is the hope that nothing will satisfy you, right? The negation of negation is you go back to the idea that nothing will satisfy you, but the emphasis now is on nothing, nothingness as a thing, that we can directly enjoy what we do not have. This, by the way, is what C.S. Lewis means by the word joy. When he wrote his book, Surprised by Joy, he was basically reflecting on this feeling of heaven that doesn't exist, that he doesn't have, that brings him joy, that he would have these moments in which he would feel the desire for heaven. He would realize that he doesn't have heaven, so he doesn't have the thing that he desires. And instead of that being painful, it would be joyous. It would bring life to him. This is all very interesting. Oh, by the way, that means for Simone Weil, it's like, it's not even that she's going like, well, God might not exist. She's kind of almost saying, well, God doesn't exist. God is the name for a non-existent reality, right? This is why it's always very hard to read Simone Weil, because atheism is in the heart of theism, right? There's a certain sense in which as soon as you objectify God and say there is God, that is not God. That's crunching the indeterminacy into a position that you can grasp. And so you can't look at Simone Weil and go, oh, she's arguing for the existence of God or not the existence of God. I mean, the word God is simply the name for a type of quantum indeterminacy that we existentially experience in our lives, that we can directly embrace, that we can directly know. Okay, I'm tempted to see if, ask if you're kind of following me here, but I'm going to keep going to the end and then I'll look at your questions. Now, I want to now just move on to Paul Tillich, and I'm going to, because there's a lot of what Tillich is doing that is similar to Simone Weil, right? But there's a different dimension to it, which I think is actually more productive. So first of all, Tillich has a similar notion of God, and like Simone Weil, he is not trying to argue for the existence of God as a being, right? Tillich and Weil are both fundamentally against that, so much so that they say that arguments for the existence of God are forms of atheism, because the God that you end up with is not the God, it's not what religious symbolism is pointing to in the word God, because it becomes an object that you can know in some way and therefore grasp in some way. So both of them reject this approach. And also both of them are kind of phenomenological in the sense that they both start with an experience of desire, right? Simone Weil is, in Gravity and Grace, is talking about not God, but a type of desire, and then from that type of desire comes to a definition of God. And this is central to her term gravity and grace. I'll just explain that and then I'll move on. The reason why this book is called Gravity and Grace is that the world of gravity is the world of things and objects, and it's the world of physicality, right? Gravity, literally everything that's pulled down. And kind of symbolically for Simone Weil, if the world was pure gravity, we're just full of things, then there would be no space for subjectivity. There would be no space for desire. What one needs is grace. And grace is not a thing, so it's not in gravity. Grace is an openness to a future possibility. Grace is the experience of an openness to another possible world, to other possible avenues. It's kind of like grace is what breaks open gravity. And so what Simone Weil is basically saying is the world is not pure gravity. I mean, you could even make this into a metaphysical argument that the world is not pure being, stuff. Because if it was, if there were no gaps, right? If there was no novelty or possibility or process, there wouldn't be anything, or all there would be is stuff, the pure thingness, which would be pure nothingness, right? So, Simone Weil is kind of going, so there has to be kind of like a gap, breaks, fissures within the world of gravity, and she calls that grace. And the religious individual is the one who directly orients themselves to those gaps, to the openness to the future. And you can hear elements of someone like John Caputo in this, where John Caputo talks about religion as an openness to the future, to other possibilities, to other understandings. So it never tries to close things down and says, here it is. And we can see this in Buddhism, where you say if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. Because the Buddha, if the Buddha was crunched into space and time, there in space and time, well, it wouldn't be the Buddha. There's something about the Buddha that is not graspable. That is always a to come. Okay, so Paul Tillich has something similar. He talks about God as a type of transcendental ground of being. He calls this ground of being that we can never grasp, that we find ourselves somehow estranged from, but unable to be one with. So Tillich's not starting with the notion of God. He actually starts with this. This is an experience of being human, is to be alienated, to be estranged, to be dissatisfied, to not find satisfaction in objects and in things. That there is something about struggle and estrangement that is part of the human condition, that we all feel. Now, most of us deny it, we repress it, we hide from it. But Tillich's argument is it's always at work, it's always there, and it's always possible to kind of begin to unpick it or bring it to the surface in our quieter moments, in our more reflective moments. And so for Tillich, God cannot be objectified, but also God is not something that you completely can remove yourself from. He says God is not a stranger, which is because you can remove yourself from a stranger, you can happen to meet a stranger, you can run away from a stranger. He says we are estranged from the absolute, which means to be estranged from your family means you're part of your family, but also not part of your family. Again, this type of indeterminacy is at work. Now, this is where Simone Weil and Paul Tillich are different, and this is where I think Tillich has something more important than Weil. Weil is a type of ascetic in many ways. Like Simone Weil was very much someone who was not of the world, who directly embraced a type of nothingness. I mean, even to the extent of eating disorders. I mean, she basically died from starvation, which is a direct eating of the nothing, right? So there's all of these elements of Simone Weil's life, but also of her practice, where she was completely detached from kind of the material world. She had a deep care and concern for people, but no connection with materiality. I mean, so there was a very ascetic kind of dimension to her life, because for her, God is the nothing. God is the non-existent reality that we can directly embrace and directly enjoy the lack. In contrast, Paul Tillich says the only way to encounter the nothingness of God is through some concrete thing. And this is what he calls ultimate concern, where he says that the only way for you to experience some transcendental reality, and for both Tillich and Simone Weil, transcendental reality is what sparks true human desire. So a pure scientistic or atheistic, in the new atheism sense of the world, that view of the world, which says there is no transcendental dimension, there is no non-material dimension to existence, is a way of basically extinguishing desire. It's a way of kind of saying all human desire is just animal desire. There is no infinite passion, as Kierkegaard would say. There's no ultimate concern. There's no sense of something that is not just valuable or very valuable, but is of infinite value. Right? That's what Paul Tillich means by ultimate concern. Is there are things in our lives that we value, and there's things in our lives that we value highly, but there's also things in the world that we value infinitely, that we think that we should give our lives for, that we should sacrifice everything for. Now, we may never do that. We may be too weak to do it, but we feel the call, we feel the sense that there are some things, and often as a child, someone's gives birth to a child, and they literally feel that there is a call from the child that calls them, the parent, that demands of the parent everything. And even if the parent doesn't live up to that call, they feel that call. Now that's a call of the transcendental. It's something that is more than just in the finite world, more than something that has value. It has infinite worth. Almost it's priceless, right? It that's what the word priceless means. It's so valuable, but then it actually leaves the realm of price altogether. So Paul Tillich starts with this notion, goes, that exists. No matter how much we try to deny it, right? We feel it in our being. The artist feels the pull of beauty that they can never paint or put into a sculpture. The philosopher and the scientist feel the pull of truth that they can never grasp. It's always to come. The lawyer and the judge, they feel the pull of justice that they can never actually incarnate in law. Right? All of these people in different ways are pulled along by something that is transcendental, that cannot be brought into the realm of being, and yet it informs them and drives them. And for Tillich, this is always expressed in a concrete thing, right? For the philosopher, it's in logic, or for the ethicist, it is in justice, and for the artist, it's in beauty. In various areas, this transcendental dimension makes its presence felt. For the parents, it might be the child. For the lover, it's the beloved, right? And so for Tillich, you cannot find satisfaction. You cannot leave the realm of the material to directly embrace the transcendental. You always have to embrace something material, a cause, a person, an idea. You embrace that in such a way that it sparks off your desire for what is more than it, right? It becomes what's called an icon, right? An idol is an object which gives you everything there visually in front of it. Icon comes from eidos, and same term as ideology, idolatry and ideology from the same root, which is to give you the transcendental in the finite, to give you the answer. There is God in front of you, there is the truth in front of you. An icon is where you have something in front of you that you love, but that draws your gaze into something beyond. It's non-totalizable. There is a dimension to the icon that is not reduced to the icon, right? So the icon is what draws you into the transcendental. And so for Tillich, we need icons. He thinks religion at its best is, well, for him there's two extremes. We all face this. On one extreme is idolatry, our demonic life, and then the other is emptiness, or a kind of one-dimensionality, right? So in our daily lives, we can life can be robbed of its desire. Now, it's always there to some extent, but we repress it, we hide it, we get on with our daily lives, and we don't feel this passion for the impossible, this passion for the transcendental. And so we just watch TV, just get on with our daily lives, and we don't feel overly alive, we don't feel overly dead, we're just getting by. And that's always a danger. And for Tillich, that's the danger of what he calls quasi-religions or secular religions. And then the other danger is the demonic, which is where you have symbols of the transcendental, justice, love, God, right? You have these symbols of something absolute, but you think that you can absolutely grasp them. You think you can have them in your hand. You know what justice is. When you fully know what justice is, you can do anything, right? You know what justice is. For Tillich, religious language at its best is designed to point to the transcendental or give it shape without claiming to have it. right? So we need language, whatever language it is, the language of the artist, the philosopher, the priest, whatever. We need a type of discourse that is neither scientistic, reducing the world to pure being, nor superstitious, which is a kind of way of being able to control the transcendental. It feels that we can have it in our hands, that we can manipulate it in various ways. So for Tillich, like scientism and superstition are the two dangers that theology is supposed to protect us from, by creating a type of discourse that is centered and finite but opens us up to the infinite. And one way of describing what that might look like is maybe, the example of my own work, for example, where I'm trying to articulate certain ideas, trying to put parotheology into language, and it always fails because I'm trying to say something that kind of isn't graspable because it doesn't really exist. But every failure to describe it, right, creates something, hopefully sometimes productive, and it helps to develop the idea. So all I'm doing is constantly failing to articulate what parotheology is. Well, parotheology isn't anything, it's just a made-up word, right? But every time that I try to define what it is, it kind of comes a little bit more into existence. But there is something in the word that is still to come, which is what generates the desire. And that's kind of like an example of just what Paul Tillich is talking about here. And I think that Paul Tillich's stuff then adds something to, or kind of grounds Simone Weil's idea, right? Both of them understand that desire is desire for the impossible, for something that is not reducible to the finite. But whereas one seems to say that we can directly embrace that nothingness, we can be satisfied by it, Paul Tillich says, no, there is actually a satisfying dissatisfaction. That what we need to do is not like leave the world of things, but attach ourselves to certain things in the world, certain people, certain causes, all the while not reducing them to some sort of idolatrous thing. He uses the example of nationalism. He says when nationalism isn't wrong, like if you love your country and you want to do good for your country and you want to see your country prosper, nothing necessarily wrong about that. But he says fascism is the demonic form of nationalism, where it's your country right or wrong, your country is the absolute, whatever the state does is the incarnation of the truth. And Stalinism is the demonization of socialism. And what other ones does he use? He has a variety of these ones, but even within Catholicism, the Crusades is the demonization of that, and we see it in every form. There's ways in which we experience the transcendental, and sometimes those symbols can then become idolatrous and close it down. All right. And then I just want to connect this then with Lacan, because Lacan, who really liked Simone Weil's aphorism, ultimately thinks that there's a fundamental problem with it, and he prefers the example of love to understand how desire functions, and he uses the very extreme example of courtly love. And courtly love was amour courtois, was this notion of love that was kind of invented in around the 13th century in France. And it was the idea that a knight would fall in love with a noblewoman, and the noblewoman would be married to somebody else, and the noblewoman would love the knight, but they would be separated. They wouldn't be able to be together because a noblewoman was with somebody else. The knight was dedicated to the protection of the realm. And so what would happen is the knight would basically devote himself to the lady and would do all and would fight for her and would ultimately die for her. And that was a very powerful kind of like love triangle, right? And what that was happening between the lover and the beloved was this deep passion that was generated through prohibition. But it wasn't just pure prohibition, because they did love each other. They desired each other. They were intimately connected in their separation. And love is kind of like that. Love is a type of embracing of the finite of someone, and also sublimating them, of seeing within this finite person something that is transcendental, something that is not reducible to their personality or to what they wear or to what they look like, or to any of those other factors which can be taken away, but that they are the icon. So you kind of like, you value them so much because they are the icon. They are your window into the transcendental dimension. So they are infinitely valued, and yet there's something non-reducible about them, that whereas somebody else doesn't have that, right? You could agree with someone about the characteristics of a person, but one of them loves that person, the other doesn't, because for one they are an icon, for the other they aren't. So all of that to say, what they and Tillich and Lacan all have in common here is a critique of the idea that we want satisfaction, right? All of them are saying we don't want satisfaction. Now, Simone Weil is the one who's kind of saying, well, it's kind of like a religion of nihilism in a way. It's like we can be satisfied in not having, right? And so she's kind of drawn to that. And what Tillich and Lacan are saying is, well, no, we can't even be satisfied in not having. There is an inherent dissatisfaction. We can't ever fully find satisfaction in getting something or in leaving it behind and directly embracing nothing. What we do is we find things in the world that open up a sense of the transcendental. And religious discourse, for someone like Tillich, that is what it's designed to do. In terms of parotheology, how all this fits is the parotheological idea is, if you've kind of been following me for a while, you know, I kind of love Zizek's notion of Christ crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" as a type of example of how there is a lack at the heart of everything, even the heart of the absolute. And as we discover that lack, and as we make room and space for that lack within us, we are able to find peace. We are satisfied in our dissatisfaction. And so within parotheology, it's a critique of the kind of like the satisfaction theology. But it's also a critique of a kind of nihilism. It's a desire for what maybe Camus called the absurd. This weird sense of being satisfied by dissatisfaction, finding contentment in our lack of contentment and in our struggles. And that there's something profoundly theological about that notion. And there is actually something profoundly scientific about that notion, but religion is about us existentially experiencing it. One thing about Tillich, by the way, which we talked about in the book group, is that Tillich is kind of saying that when you love yourself, for example, what you're doing is, you're not saying, right, you're perfect, right? There's an idea of maybe we are perfect the way we are, and there is no lack or gap within us. This is just some sort of illusion, and you kind of like accept you're kind of that we are already there. We're already perfect. We're already part of the whole. But neither is it that we're not there yet and we have to strive and there's somewhere to get to. So when you feel guilty, for example, you feel guilty because you are not someone you think you should be. You have a vision of who you should be and you're falling short of that, and that experience is guilt. For Tillich, the response to guilt is not either to say, well, you really already are perfect, so don't feel guilty, right? Nor is it, well, you should feel guilty, but you could, through hard work, get to who you really are, right? There is a real you, and you just have to strive for it. For Tillich, he says, no, to love and to love yourself is to embrace the guilt, that the sense that there is a lack within you, there is a dissatisfaction within you, and to not try to always overcome it, and to not try to deny it, but to find a place of acceptance for it. And as you do that, you will actually become a better person, right? And this is grace, and this is the Pauline idea of, right, the law tells you what you should do, but also is the thing that stops you from doing it. Whereas love is this thing that says you don't have to do anything, right? You're accepted, right? Grace, you feel this acceptance. And in the ability to accept the dissatisfaction and the lack that is within you, you actually find yourself able to live better in the world, to be a nicer person in the world. So that's just kind of an analogy of how, kind of in parotheology, the idea is not to run from the lack or try to deny it, but somehow try to find a way to mobilize it in a positive way. Okay, just going to look and see if you've got any questions and take it from there. Let's see. Oh yeah, Julie, I think Julie, your cornflower girl, you love the layered meaning between nothing and no thing. Yes, I was reading the article that I put that accompanied this, which I realized once I put it in, it's actually a very difficult article, but the first couple of pages beautifully outline what Simone Weil is saying. So the other stuff, you probably need a background in psychoanalysis, but the first few pages of the article that I included for this seminar, whenever I read, nothing satisfies us, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's the move from nothing can satisfy you to nothing is satisfying. Let's see. So Rob says, with this thinking, could we make a distinction between fulfillment and satisfaction? We know we will never be fulfilled and always lack. And in this, we can be satisfied. So a dialectic move. Yeah, absolutely. I often use fulfillment and satisfaction interchangeably, because like in a popular way they are, but I think that's a good way of saying, like, fulfillment is the word full, to fulfill, and to fulfill something is to make it filled. But satisfaction doesn't have that connotation. I don't know what the etymology is, but to be satisfied doesn't have the same strength of fulfillment. So I think you can definitely make a distinction there. A distinction that's often made, and Todd McGowan uses it, is between pleasure and enjoyment. That enjoyment is the type of happiness that comes from not having. So there is a type of pleasure that comes from having something. The toy at Christmas, winning the lottery is pleasurable, but the enjoyment is in imagining you're going to win the lottery. And the reason why I like that is because joy is a theological concept, and joy, the way C.S. Lewis describes it, is the pleasure of not having. And so I also think that's a good one. So fulfillment, satisfaction, pleasure, and enjoyment, I think can help us understand this. Gabrielle, you know psychoanalysis very well. So this is really in your wheelhouse. She says, the death of the father opens up a space for that nothing to be a no thing that is there and is always open. According to Weil, that would be grace. In psychoanalysis, that's castration. Okay, yes. So the death of the father opens up a space for that nothing to be a no thing. According to Weil, that would be grace. In psychoanalysis, castration. Yes, I think so. Funnily enough, the way it's put in the article is that for Weil, God is the treasure that cannot be grasped. And that the name for that for Lacan is the phallus, but the phallus is connected to castration. The phallus is basically a nothing. It's a something that is nothing. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's really right. Kate says, so what is the difference for Weil between the God she describes and the one that just doesn't exist? Why is that kind of God needed? I'm thinking of the invisible gardener thought experiment. Yeah, I mean, this is clever for both Weil and Tillich, is that God doesn't exist. Like, it's not that God doesn't exist. God is non-existent. God is a non-existent being, and that's why sometimes some of these thinkers, and I've used this term, say, atheism doesn't go far enough, because the non-existence of God is kind of like leads to an emptiness. But God is a non-existent thing, as in a kind of a gap, a hole, is kind of explains desire in a more fundamental way. That there's not just a kind of Yeah, there's not just kind of like a nothing. There is, as what Gabrielle was saying, a no thing. So the reason why Vey thinks that atheism is, I mean, if anything, just kind of shallow, it's because it's, I guess, maybe it says, it's like, this is why a lot of atheism and humanism is connected with evolutionary psychology, right? They're all really intertwined, because evolutionary psychology basically says that human subjectivity is like just functions on evolutionary lines. We're utilitarians, right? Utilitarianism is another form. These are all very connected. You'll find in smart people, there'll be utilitarians, evolutionary biologists, humanists, and atheists. And someone like Vey would feel that the thing they're missing is the no thing that actually makes humans humans. This, we lack in a different way than other animals. The lack is, it's like the difference between nothing and debt, right? Having no money and debt. I don't know if I'm answering the question. Let's see what you said again. So what's it? Yeah. So that's it. It's like the difference between nothing and debt. It's going like, no, you have to have the mystics. The mystical atheism is so much more profound. Like there's something about the universe that has an active nothing, a nothing that is something, and this is funny. This is different from, as I say, what's going on in the world of physics, but it's an analogous kind of conversation, right? Or in mathematics and that kind of stuff. So I don't know if that answers it. It's just atheism is an attempt to kind of just, is to render the nothing nothing. It's the difference between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy as well. In analytic philosophers, they go like, what are you talking about? Nothing? Nothing is nothing. It's of no value. Whereas continental philosophers generally think that there is a type of cut in reality that is something that generates desire, that generates ethics, that generates profound evil, that generates diversity within biological organisms. So there's a type of nothing that is actually profoundly transformative. So it's almost like saying zero. As soon as you say zero, you've symbolized it, you've made it into something, and that was an advance for mathematics. Scott says, what's your ultimate concern? And I always wonder, like, can you... if your ultimate concern is whatever it is that drives, that kind of opens up the transcendental dimension to you, one of the ways that reflects in my life, on the vague occasion that it does, is maybe, especially when I was writing back, when I wrote it was like 6 books years ago. I haven't written for a while, I need to get back to it. But the reason why I wrote 6 books in a row very quickly was because there was something driving, something I was trying to say that kept failing. And so I think there was a dimension of that going on there, and it reflects in one's personal life as well, so, but I'd have to think about that. Kate says, Gabrielle says, the debt that is something and the debt that is forgiven and becomes nothing. Absolutely, that's very, very key. Just Gabrielle's bringing up this idea of like whenever a debt is paid, it's filled. When a debt's forgiven, the nothing that's something is rendered nothing. Funnily enough, the Lord's Prayer, the original, is about debts. So, and if you read, I think it's in the King James, you read, forgive us our debts as we forgive the debts of others. So it's not like, repay our debts as we pay the debts of others. It actually is, and it's supposedly, somebody was telling me the other day that it was connected with economic factors, like you can connect the Lord's Prayer to kind of like a dig at some of the economic issues of the day. So forgive our debtors. It's not like forgive your sins. It's something almost economic. Kate, is the lover versus the beloved the embodiment of the difference between desire and love? Hence why romance is about trying to bring the two into the same person. Yeah, so something I talked about in the Fundamentalists, which Kate's referring to, is We can desire what we don't have, and we can love what we do. So someone can love the person they're with and desire someone they're not with, and not desire the person that they love, but desire someone that they don't love, right? To cut into very simple categories. And you could say that desire in that way is in the register of lack. That often we desire something that is either not, we can't get, or is under threat of being taken away. So someone desires when they're jealous because there's a threat, someone's going to take my partner away, and that generates their desire. Or they're like, I really am attracted to that person who I can't go out with because they're with somebody else, and that impossibility generates desire. And then love, more precisely, maybe Todd McGowan would maybe say this, that love itself in its purest or its best form is actually the embrace of desire as well. But yeah, you can love, you love the person you're with, you desire the person you're not with. And romance, I use the term romance as the art of bringing the two together, and that's what you could say a good relationship is whenever, almost taking courtly love, which is this extreme sense of not having, and kind of marrying the person you really desire, but in some way maintaining some sort of distance to them. Difficult to do, but yeah, the art of romance is the art of bringing desire and love together. At least that's what I was arguing in the Fundamentalists. I'll just do a couple more. Daniel, would there be a way to move on from the miser's desire? Is he fearful of spending his money because this would bring him into reality? Is he fearful of reality? Yeah, this is what I've talked about before, actually, is that one thing about the miser is misers usually have a terrible life. They're completely in poverty and maybe have terrible relationships with other people, especially because they're keeping the treasure, not just from themselves, but from other people. This is something that is very important, is a miser often gets enjoyment not only from not having the treasure themselves, but for other people not having them, right? So like Jeff Bezos, for example, has so much money that he can't spend, right? But also nobody else can. It's removed from the economy. There's a certain amount of his money that's not removed from the economy, but there's a massive amount that he can't use because, as I say, there's only a certain amount of cars and clothes you can have, but also nobody else can use. So misers often get some sort of weird enjoyment from other people not having it as well. Anyway, in that way, the miser's treasure is like a fetish object that prevents them from seeing the poverty of their existence. And I think there's something really, really important in that. And I think this is the problem with Simone Weil. Her life was a mess. It was horrific. It was like the life of a miser. She wasn't a miser, she was the opposite. She was this incredibly gracious and completely selfless individual, but her life was a one of suffering and one of profound depression and pain. So I think that's one of the reasons why Lacan ultimately didn't think the analogy of the miser was good. There's something about the miser that when you follow that analogy, kind of so disconnects us with the world that we somehow can live in abject poverty and not feel the pain of that, which, by the way, Simone Weil would advocate for. She kind of advocated for an extreme asceticism where you embrace poverty, you have no desire for any treasures, right? You eat bread, drink water, kind of like have no interest in the world. And that's why I like and prefer Tillich's ultimate concern, because ultimate concern, you can't do that. Their only way to the transcendental is through an embrace of the material. Not every material, but an embrace of something in the world that opens up the transcendental, and therefore means you're not embracing some extreme kind of disembodied, kind of amaterial kind of life. Oh yes, someone's asked me, can I clarify Das Ding from the article? If you read the article, Das Ding is, I guess initially Das Ding was the name for the mother, right, or the primary caregiver, who you're separated from and then you always want to get back to, but you never can. What we're kind of marked by this sense of a loss. When you separate from your primary caregiver through a third, which is symbolically the father who separates the mother and the child, right? But those can be played by anybody. But when the two separate, there is a feeling of a profound loss, and the lost object can be called das Ding, the thing, that we're marked by, that we want to return to. So it's the nothing that generates our desire. So we're always looking for something that will be like the thing, but we never find it. And so, people manipulate that all the time by giving us the idea of objects that might be das Ding. So that's one way of understanding it, is it's kind of like it's the kind of let us call it the echo of the loss of the mother, rendered into an object that we want back, but we can't get back because it never existed. All right, thank you so much. I hope that was it. Like, what I was doing there was basically mostly doing that, thinking off the top of my head, getting this stuff into some sort of structure, so that I can kind of maybe make this into a chapter of a book. I'm thinking of writing a book called God is Not, is dash not. So you read it, God is not. God is the kind of quantum indeterminacy. And I'm thinking of starting with Simone Weil. So really what you've been doing is helping me work out potentially the first chapter of that book. So I appreciate you being my guinea pigs. Thank you so much. And I'll see you all again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.